Welcome to our lecture on CIPC, the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission, our regulator who governs the Companies Act and everything related to the Companies Act, and also intellectual property, which is trademarks, and copyright, which is far more interesting than the scope of this particular module, but nevertheless still remains a frustrating government organization to deal with. Primarily and for our purposes, CIPC is responsible for the registration of companies, for cooperatives, and for registering intellectual properties, being trademarks, patents, designs, copyright, and maintaining all of those registrations and things that are relevant to it. It also houses all the central repository for information on companies, and it has a duty to disclose all that information that it holds in its registers, so it's also available to the public. It has a duty to promote education and awareness of company law and intellectual property law, and it has a duty to promote compliance with that legislation. It efficiently and effectively enforces the relevant legislation, so it will tell you. And it has to monitor compliance with financial reporting standards and make recommendations to the Financial Reporting Standards Council. Now, it's only ever done this once with very limited success in terms of one of our state-owned entities. It also licenses business rescue practitioners who are very busy during the COVID period, and it has a duty to report to the Minister and to provide research and to advise the Minister on matters of national policy relating to company and intellectual property law. So in our current COVID state in which we live, the registration of companies as essential service providers was all done through CIPC, and if you go onto their website, you'll be able to see how you could go about registering a company for that particular ambit. And it was quite interesting to see that CIPC was able to pick up the ball quite quickly after the President announced the lockdown and the implementation of essential services. In order to transact on CIPC, generally speaking, not under COVID, one has to go and develop a personal profile, which you do at their website, cipc.co.za. You register and you're given a unique customer code, which is allocated to you. And then, in theory, all your functions can then be done online. So you don't have to go and stand in a queue. In fact, they've actually closed their physical offices, which can be quite frustrating when their website is down or you have a query, because it's very difficult to get hold of a human being. But you can now open your company online and pay all your annual returns and change your directors and change your auditors and appoint your very important company secretary, all online. One of the reasons for limiting human interactions is because this department became so susceptible to bribery and corruption, and some of our top law firms were involved in bribing the CIPC officials to process documents quickly and not to lose documents, and officials wouldn't actually do work unless you bribed them, so it was a real hotbed of corruption. So that's one of the reasons that everything is online. They do have 21 business days to respond to any inquiries that you might make, and they have improved tremendously in terms of their efficiency, but they can still randomly do things and not to do things, and then take a very long time to fix what they have or have not done. And here is a little graphic about how one goes about getting your code, and it comes off the CIPC site, which is quite user-friendly because it's got lots of these graphics and even lawyers like me can follow it. CIPC has quite a complex organizational structure with the commissioner sitting right at the top, and it has its own internal audit processes, and it has a governance, risk and compliance department, and it has a strategy as well. And then it goes on to have all kinds of business components as to how it delivers its services to the greater South Africa. Let's have a look at registering a company on CIPC. And I would suggest that you do this. It's actually quite fun. Go and register as a user, that's free. And then go and register a company. You'll need to part with about 150 Rand for your registration fees up front. And then you'll need to pay your annual returns on an annual basis thereafter. But if you are an aspiring company secretary, it gives you a good exposure to how to go about registering companies and how to interact with CIPC and what their requirements and their processes are. And if you ever want to be an independent contractor, then you will have a little company. So how we go about registering a company, you start by registering yourself on CIPC and you deposit money, like a little token box almost. And then most importantly, you have to reserve the company's name. We will go into a discussion on what the requirements are around naming companies, so I won't belabor that too much now. And then you have to register the MOI. We'll also go into some requirements around the MOI, that's the Memorandum of Incorporation, and it's like the company's little Bible. It is the governing document for that company, and it governs the powers of the shareholders, and once those are appointed, then the directors, how they can manage the company. And you can have a very, very simple MOI for a very small company, or as you become a bigger company, so you will have a more complex MOI that's more tailor-made, and the Companies Act does allow for companies to alter certain provisions of the Companies Act, to tweak things to that suit them, and so that would all be contained in the MOI. Then you need to submit certain documentation when you register a company. The incorporator's certified ID. So the incorporator is essentially the person who's incorporating the company, which would be you. Now, you may also be a director and you may also be a shareholder. You may outsource that to somebody else who sits in front of the computer and then inputs that information. Then they would not necessarily be the incorporator. You may still be the incorporator. It isn't necessarily the person who sits and inputs the information into the computer, but it is the person who initiates the incorporation of this company. With regards to certified documents, CIPC is absolutely pain in the backside pedantic about this. It has to be an original certification and it has to be less than 3 months old, which you then promptly submit electronically. So how the hell they know whether or not it's an original certification, one can't tell, aside from the fact that I once had documents declined by CIPC because there were punch marks from where I had punched an original document and put it in a file and then submitted it, and they declined it because they could see the punch marks in it. So be prepared for some interesting feedback from them. And then as you are incorporating your new company, you will obviously need to appoint directors. Somebody needs to manage this company, and they will also need to have their ID certified and a consent to act. In the olden days, this used to be a Form 20, CM27. It now doesn't have a number, but it's very important that directors consent to becoming directors of the company. And on this consent form, there is actually a summary of Section 66, which sets out who is eligible or not eligible to be a director, and it sets out our beloved and well-known Section 75, 76, and 77 of the Companies Act. And they have to, when they consent, they have to agree that they understand those sections and they must abide by them. You then have to submit your name certificate, which you will have received once you have reserved your name and your name has been granted to you. So it may take a day or two for the name to come through, and then you have to continue this process once you have your name certificate. And if you are acting on behalf of anybody, i.e. you are not actually the incorporator, then you have to submit a power of attorney. And there's a little infographic there with 5 steps to registering a company on CIPC. Let's talk about naming conventions. Now this is quite fun. So every company has a registration number. Names of companies can change frequently, but numbers never change. That's like your ID number, it stays with that company forever. And you can actually have that registration number as the name of the company. I mean, how boring and unimaginative is that? But nevertheless, this is what it would look like if the registration number was the name. In my first bullet point, you would have K and then the registration number, and then in brackets afterwards, South Africa. Woohoo! That wasn't terribly creative. You'll have a look at the registration number, and it has a bit of a structure to it. So the 2018 is obviously the year in which the company was incorporated. Then there's 6 digits in the middle, which are sequentially organized for that year. And then there's 2 digits after the last slash, that second slash. Where you see 07, it means it's a private company. Where you see 06, it means it's a public company. 23 means it's a closed corporation, and 30 means it's a state-owned company. IT, and where you see IT and then slash and then 5 numbers, that is what a trust looks like. When you think of a name, you have to be quite creative. You cannot pick a name that is confusingly similar to another name, something that might prejudice trademark laws, so you can't pass yourself off as somebody else. You can't falsely imply association with somebody else either, so that you can leverage off their marketability. You cannot use a word on its own that is already in existence. And a good example of this is the company I work for is called Huge Group. Now, Huge Group together on its own is perfectly acceptable, and we have lots of subsidiary companies called Huge Connect or Huge Networks, but you can never register Huge on its own because that is a word which already exists. One of our companies is called Acknowledge, and we wanted to register Acknowledge, and we couldn't because Acknowledge is a dictionary word. So you also can't pass yourself off to be something that you are not, and you cannot create the incorrect impression as to ownership. So you can't call yourself Ramaphosa's Cafe and hope that people believe that you are in some way representing our esteemed leader. You also cannot use a name which constitutes propaganda, incitement of violence, any sort of ethnic discrimination, gender or religious bias, and that will not be acceptable to CIPC. Now, if you have a company which has a ring-fenced provision in its MOI, then you have to have the words or the letters RF in brackets included in the name of the company. So you would have Smith Investments RF Pty Limited. And the reason that you have the RF and the explanation of to ring-fenced provisions is the following. If your MOI limits the or restricts the ability of the company to do business, so the MOI says this company may only invest in property, or this company can only be used to hold shareholdings in a nominee capacity for investors, which is where we find them very often. It's not a trading company like you would find Sally Sweets Pty Limited, who can just do business with anyone. There is a restriction on how this company can do business. Then it must publicly be indicated to the world at large that it has these ring-fenced provisions. so therefore it has to be in the name. And then after the ring fenced or not, as the case may be, you would then have to include the naming conventions as to the type of company. So PTY Limited is for a private company, Limited is a public company, NPC would be for a non-profit company. Non-profit companies would also have the 07 behind them. If you want to change the name of a company, you will need to change your MOI. Anytime that you change your MOI, you need shareholder approval because it's the Bible of the company and it's the thing that protects the shareholders' rights with regard to that company. So even changing the name, you have to go and get shareholder approval. And before you change the name, you have to reserve a name. So you write off to CIPC and you say, please, can we reserve these names? And you have to submit the names, and they will come back with one of their official forms to say that they have reserved a name for you. Any changes to the MOI are done on a COR 15.2 form, and I will go through some of the forms. I'm not big on remembering numbers. There are some that are important to remember, and a 15.2 is probably the most important. Right, let's have a look at MOIs and new companies. So an MOI, as I said, sets out the rights, duties and responsibilities of all the shareholders and directors. It deals with how the share capital in the company is going to be managed, or if it has no share capital, how the rest of the authorities will devolve in terms of the powers and the shareholders, the powers of the shareholders and the directors. Then there are standard templates for MOIs because we aren't all lawyers, and my God, even on a good day, an MOI is a very boring document. Right, so 15.1a is a short standard MOI. It can only be used by private companies. It is literally 1 page long. And if you were to go and register your own company, this is the document you would use. Then the 1B is a standard long format MOI, and this must be used by public companies, state-owned companies, and personal liability companies unless you choose to adopt your own. So a public company, for example, could not use that short form MOI. 1C is the short standard form for NPCs that have no members. Remember that a non-profit company can have no members. And then equally, there is a long standard MOI for NPCs with no members, and there is a short standard MOI for NPCs with no members. One would imagine that a small NPC that didn't have many obligations would possibly have a short standard MOI. Where it's a more complex organization and they want to start altering terms in the Companies Act that are alterable, they would then need to use that long standard MOI. And NPCs can have members, or and certain instances can not have members. At the end of the day, doesn't matter whether they have members or not, they have no share capital to manage. You can, as I mentioned, adopt your own MOI as long as it meets certain provisions. Now, in the Companies Act, as we are used to with legislation, it says from 1 to 300, here are the things you must do. However, in the course of that 1 to 300, there are certain things where they give you a choice. They'll say you can change this to something slightly different. And I'll give you 2 examples of that. One is where the chairman has a second vote. So in our current Companies Act, it says the chairman may not have a casting vote unless the MOI provides otherwise. So the chairman you may decide that the chairman should have 2 votes, in which case you then need to put that into your MOI, and that is an alterable provision. Private companies are not required to have audit committees unless the MOI says that they must. So that is an alterable provision that you can then slot into your MOI. Obviously, unalterable provisions are those sections of the Companies Act which cannot be changed, and you are stuck with them the way that they are. In the olden days, and when I say the olden days, I mean before 2011 and our new Companies Act came into effect, you used to have a thing called par value. And what that was some nominal, notional, and completely irrelevant value that was attached to your share. It could be 0.01 cents, and it could be as much as 1 whole rand. It is no indication of the market value of that share at all. But the Companies Act does have a provision which requires that when you issue shares, there has to be some consideration paid for them. So this par value used to represent that consideration. In the new Companies Act, we still have to have a consideration, but we've done away with this concept of par value. So what that consideration is entirely between the parties to whom the shares are issued. You will not find a par value share. There are in companies that were registered pre-2011 that may still have par value shares, and that's fine. That doesn't matter. You can do away with the par value by going through a little CIPC process and updating the MOI. Otherwise, you can just leave them be with their silly par values. But any new companies that are registered after 2011 are not going to reflect a par value for the shares. Then Section 15 includes these rules for the company, which are optional. They are alterable provisions that you can include if you so wish. Then we have the ring-fenced provisions, which I did explain a little earlier. These are the provisions which are unique to that particular MOI and very common in investment companies. Where you have a company that just is going to have that one sole purpose and you want to make sure that it can never do anything else, just that one thing, particularly in financial services, it's very important. Then you will have a little ring-fenced entity and you put people's money in there and it's nice and protected from the outside. Some of these MOIs will actually say they can't even have transferable funds that come in and out other than what they're specifically designated to do. So nobody can steal the money. The money can only be invested by an investment banker through an investment process. You can't even do an EFT in these as a normal course of business in these accounts. If you find yourself with an existing company and it's a pre-2011 company, it's already in existence, and it has the old MOI, which used to be called the Memorandum and Articles of Association. You must convert it to a new format MOI, any of the formats that we discussed. The reason is that not that a memorandum of and articles of association, which we then call the M and AOA, is now irrelevant. It still functions, it still supports the company, but you must update it because there will be conflicts between what was in the old Companies Act and what's in the new Companies Act. And you could have a situation where you put your company at risk where it's non-compliant with the new Companies Act. You used to have a process up until 2013 where it was free to convert the MOIs, and after that you now have to pay your 100 Rand. You're not going to get a fine, that's fine, but please do it. If you are a listed company and the JSE discovers that you've got one of these old articles of association stuck somewhere in your subsidiary companies, they will be quite grumpy and your auditors should have picked it up by now. Nevertheless, it's not a difficult process to convert, and it needs to be done. You do want to make sure that you can avoid any conflicts that might arise. All rights that were granted under the 1973 Companies Act, or an old MOA, so to speak, will remain intact. So if you have preference shares that were granted under the old Act, they still have their rights, they still exist. The new Companies Act doesn't talk about preference shares. The reason being is that a preference share is really just a normal share with some special rights attached to it, which the parties have agreed between themselves, and those rights only apply to those holders of those preference shares. So you can do that ordinarily with normal ordinary shares, and you classify them in your share register separately. You don't need to separately go and change your authorized share capital at CIPC to do so. You can also have a look for any shareholders agreements that you might have, bearing in mind that that's an agreement between shareholders themselves. So Mr. Smith and Mrs. Jones, who are going to be shareholders in Sally's Apples, the company, they decide between themselves how they are going to regulate their relationship, and they do that in their shareholders agreement. That shareholders agreement does not override the MOI. The MOI will always remain paramount. So if you have an old articles and a shareholders agreement, and you need to then convert them to this MOI, make sure that you put in all the conflicts. You manage it so that there's no conflicts in your new document, and everything is aligned well. And if there are any conflicts between the MOI and the Companies Act, or the old articles and the Companies Act, the Act will, of course, always prevail. Then I have a case, Verso Financial Services versus Berger, and it's definitely not on page 142 of your textbook. It's on page 142 of my textbook. But please let me know if you'd like to have a look at this case, or you can Google it. It's quite interesting. What happened was the company had the old articles, they failed to update them, and they ended up with a big conflict that between the legislation and their MOI, and they got into a lot of trouble. If you want to amend your MOI, then there are specific procedures that you need to follow. The MOI itself will tell you how to amend it, so go and read that document. But the Companies Act also sets out requirements too. You will need shareholder approval. Section 60 of the Companies Act allows you to do that shareholder approval by written resolution. So if you have a small number of shareholders, you can just do a round robin resolution, that's fine. Otherwise, if you have a large number of shareholders, you will need to convene a proper general meeting, which can be a lot more tricky to do. If you are a listed company, you cannot pass a shareholders resolution by way of a round robin. The JSE doesn't allow that. If, however, there are just very minor amendments that need to be made to your MOI, a spelling mistake, a grammar error, some punctuation, you can amend that without shareholder approval. I've never had to do this, so I don't know what CIPC would say. I must tell you, I'd probably just leave a spelling error as long as it wasn't going to cause a material conflict in some way. And then there is question as to whether or not you should then go and make a public announcement around that amendment. So I think making a public announcement would be far more onerous than simply getting shareholder approval to amend such a small thing. Anyway, that is the process. If a shareholder objects to any alteration that has been made to an MOI, so for example, now shareholder approval is required, so 75% of the shareholders must agree to the amendment of the MOI by way of a special resolution. And if someone in that 25% is still very angry that this resolution passed, they can go off to the company's tribunal and have a whinge. I'm not sure how effective it will be, but nevertheless they have the right to do so. If there are any material amendments that need to be made, those obviously have to go to shareholders for approval, and amendments can be demanded by a court order. So a court could order a company to amend its MOI if there was something in the MOI that was contrary to the Companies Act, or something else broader. Where you are going to change your authorized share capital, then you will need to also change your MOI. Your authorized share capital is the biggest amount of shares that you could possibly ever issue. It is different from your issued share capital, which is the number of shares you actually have issued. The differentiation between those is outside of the scope of this course, and happily you can learn all about those next semester. But if you're going to change your authorized share capital, then you will need to go to CIPC to do that. And you will need a special resolution, and any of the shareholders holding up to 10% of the shares can propose or request the board to propose a resolution to the rest of the shareholders. A quorum for a shareholders meeting is 25% of the issued share capital must be represented. So at least 25% must come along to your meeting or sign your resolution, and the approval of that is 75% of that 25%. So although the number of 75% sounds very high, it's only of 25% of your issued shares. So a very small portion of shareholders can actually approve shareholder resolutions which impact all the shareholders. So quite broad. Anyway, once you've got your shareholders resolution all signed, you go and you lodge your COR 15.2 form with CIPC within 10 days of that resolution, along with your amended MOI, and off you go and you submit that to CIPC. Let's look at written resolutions to amend the MOI. As I mentioned, this is permitted by Section 60 of the Companies Act, unless you are a listed entity, in which case it will not be allowed. You would submit this written resolution to shareholders on the same basis as you would in terms of organizing a general meeting. So it's 15 business days. You have to give them the notice, and you've got to circulate it to them, and they must then vote on it within 20 days after they have received it. Normally what happens with shareholders resolutions is that you're all in the same room together, or you're all within a day's reach of each other, so you don't give the notice period. They all agree to waive the notice period, and everybody signs at the same time, and these ridiculous 15 working days and 20 business days just don't really come into play that often. Shareholders resolutions can be ordinary resolutions where they have a 50% pass, and special resolutions which require 75% pass. They have the same quorum requirements as they had under the old Companies Act, which was the 25% of the issued shares must be represented. And once your round robin resolution has been signed, it has exactly the same effect as if it had been adopted at a shareholders meeting convened for that purpose. So there's no less value or less binding because it was done in writing. After the resolution has been adopted, you've got 10 days in order you must then notify your shareholders that they have what they have voted for. So since we were all probably in the same room, I think you've got to notify them whether or not it's passed. I think they know whether or not it's passed. You cannot deal with certain matters in by way of written resolution, and those are typically matters that are related to issues reserved for the annual general meeting. Now, as an aside, there are so many carve-outs in the Companies Act, which means that it says you can't deal with these matters in an annual general meeting. But then when you go and have a look at those matters in different sections of the Companies Act, there is a way in which you can do them at a general meeting. So it actually becomes, there's pretty much everything can be done by way of a paper resolution. Sometimes if you have a large shareholding base, it does become very problematic to try and circulate a written resolution, and then it's just easier to convene a proper physical meeting. When you have incorporated your company, you need to have your first formal board meeting. Interestingly, this is the only board meeting that is actually prescribed by the Companies Act. Thereafter, the Companies Act prescribes how board meetings should happen, but it never tells you when you should have a board meeting. This is the only board meeting that the Companies Act says that you have to have at a certain point in the company's timeline. So upon incorporation, you have this board meeting, and it is the subscribers or the incorporators of the MOI who meet. Typically, these will be directors who may also then be shareholders, and they meet and they set out the structure of the MOI, and they will note the certificate of incorporation and the MOI, the date of the company's registration, the registration number, its registered office, financial year end, any additional appointments of directors, the appointment of a chairperson, the CEO, the company secretary, the auditors, what that authorized share capital and issued share capital looks like, and then approving the allotment of shares to the shareholders. If it's a new company, there will also obviously be requirements for registration with SARS and tax for tax purposes, for VAT and whatnot. And if it is a non-profit company, then they will need to register with the Department of Social Services for their tax exemptions. Let's have a look at how you go about appointing a director on CIPC. You have to submit certain documentation, being a board resolution, because the board resolves to appoint directors. They then go to shareholders through the AGM process, which is where the shareholders then get the opportunity to vote on them and vote them out. Shareholders also get to nominate directors, but the actual point at which the director is appointed to the board happens in a board resolution, which the board itself does. And that director needs to complete that consent to act form, which I discussed, and you have to get their certified ID, and you submit it off to CIPC. Equally, if you want to resign a director, you need a resolution of the board accepting the resignation of that director, and you need a letter of resignation from the director. It doesn't need to be all the sob story about why he hates the company. He can produce that for the company, but for your purposes, just one blank, very dull letter that says, I hereby tender my resignation as a director of this company. That's all CIPC want. And please don't send them the sob story, because it could end up in public records. And you submit that to CIPC, and they go along and they update your register of directors. Appointing auditors, you need a board resolution, and you have to fill in a COR 44 form, and you need the audit partner's certified ID. You'll also need the audit partner's specific registration number that each audit partner has, and that has to go along too. And you submit that to CIPC. Appointing a company secretary, As you know, the board appoints the company secretary, so there has to be a resolution. You also need a COR 44 for this particular appointment. That form deals with both auditors and company secretaries and what they describe us as the officers of the company. And we also have to sign a consent form to act as an officer, and we send our ID and off we go. If we want to change our address, we just need a resolution of the board. We do not need a shareholders resolution, thank goodness. And we sign our COR 21.1 and we submit that to CIPC. Now, for the purposes of this module, I've really just set out 4 or 5 processes that one needs to know, and they do make for a few interesting exam questions. So just be sure that you know what documentation has to go in for what particular function. But I have included for reference purposes a little table of the documents that you would primarily use in a company secretarial practice. Under the old Act, there were CM forms, and you may still find these CM forms. Most large companies were incorporated before 2011, so we still have CM forms knocking around, and they are still relevant. Under the new Act, I've then given you the new name of what those documents are called. So when you are scratching through your statutory records, because the bank wants the CM44, oh my heavens, and if your company was registered after 2011, you are not going to find a CM44. It is all in that MOI and that registration certificate. So that is just for reference purposes. I'm not going to give you a pop quiz on what each of those documents are named. Let's have a look at the public interest score and how one calculates that. This is governed by the Companies Act and is particularly relevant when it comes to paying annual returns. Now, if you don't pay your annual returns, CIPC get very grumpy with you, and after a number of years, they will actually deregister your company. It also looks very bad if someone else goes into your company records, the public company records on CIPC, and they see you haven't paid your registration fee, your annual returns, beg your pardon. So please make sure that you pay your annual returns. So how one calculates a public interest score? It is the first calculation is the number of points equal to the average number of employees of the company during the financial year. So if you started with 10 and you ended with 12, the average would be 11, so you've got 11 employees. 1 point for every R1,000,000 or part thereof of third-party liability at the financial year end. So that means if you have 1.2 million rand liability, it's 1 point for the 1 million and then 1 point for the part. So 2 points for your 1.2 million liability. Liability is debt, and you'll find it in the balance sheet, and I use the total figure for liability. And then 1 point for every 1 million or portion thereof in turnover for that financial year. Again, 1 million for each point or part thereof. So if you have 1.2 million rand turnover, then you would have 2 points. Just to explain the concept of turnover, again, I don't know why the accounting fraternity has to keep using different names for exactly the same thing. Turnover is revenue. You find it at the very top line of the income statement, which they've now decided to call the statement of profit and loss. So they do keep us on our toes. So you add those together, and then 1 point for every individual who is, in terms of a profit company, a beneficial shareholder in the company, or in a non-profit company is a member of that company, bearing in mind that non-profit companies don't have share capital. So once you add that all together, you come to your public interest score. And here is where it starts to get interesting. If you have less than 100 and you are an owner-managed business, then you only have to compile your financials. That's all you have to do. If you are not owner managed, i.e. there is a manager and a shareholder involved, two separate parties, then you have to produce your financials, but you also have to get some degree of independent review. If you have between 100 and 349 in your public interest score, it means you now have more additional obligations because you have a higher vested interest from the public. So if you compile your annual financials internally, then you need an audit. But if somebody independent compiles your financial statements for you, then you only need an independent review. From 350 up, you must produce audited annual financial statements. King says if you are going to produce these annual financial statements, then you should consider having either a voluntary audit committee, which is very rare, but some degree of independent oversight in respect of those financials. So you might have one independent non-executive director who sits on a finance committee and oversees these financials and gives some element of review to that reporting. If you have a public interest score of over 500, this is when you are required to have a social and ethics committee. The reason being that now you are impacting a greater number of stakeholders, and there are a lot more obligations that you have to the public that you will need to consider. Annual returns, as I mentioned, have to be paid to CIPC on an annual basis. Otherwise, they get a bit grumpy, and it's due and payable on the anniversary of the company's registration, or within 30 days of that. And if you are late, then you end up paying a fine. You have to submit these electronically. And nowadays, you also have to submit a compliance certificate, which I will show you shortly. And the amounts that you have to pay in terms of this annual report, these annual returns for Companies Act. When you for companies, when you're very small, you're looking at 100 rand. But when you start to get very big, when you have turnover or revenue of over 25 million, then you have to pay 3,000 rand a year. And there are certain penalties for not doing that. If you are a closed corporation, you also have to pay your annual returns. They're calculated on exactly the same basis on your public interest score, through your public interest score and your revenue. And if you are very small, you just have to pay your 100 rand. But if you are very big, you have to pay 4,000 rand. There's not a lot of closed corporations left anymore, certainly not very many with over 50 million rand. Here is the compliance checklist that CIPC brought out in the beginning of the year. So when you submit your annual returns, you need to go through this checklist and tick yes, no, or non-applicable to relevant sections of the Companies Act. So, and then it has to be signed off by a director. So in your role as company secretary, make sure that the director signing this really understands what is contained in this checklist, because there are areas where there is going to be financial or personal liability. And right at the very top of the list is section 4, which deals with the solvency and liquidity test, and that has an implication on section 45 for, which is the financial assistance and loans. So please be very careful when you look at this checklist. Make sure that you have actually complied with all of these things, and if you haven't, quickly fix it before you ask that director to sign this compliance checklist. You can no longer submit your annual return without this compliance checklist. And there's page 2 of the checklist, which has a personal declaration that relates to section 215, which says that if you provide any false information in this checklist, you have committed an offence, which is ostensibly going to land you in a lot of trouble. And go to jail. Yay! Right, let's have a look at how you get rid of a company, should you so wish. If a company has been inactive for the last 7 years, it has no assets, no liabilities, there's no likelihood that the company will be liquidated. Talk about liquidation just now. Or the company's been transferred to a foreign jurisdiction. All you need is a board resolution, or if it's in a foreign jurisdiction, you will need a special resolution, and you submit that off to CIPC, and they will deregister your company. Deregister essentially means that the company goes to sleep. It doesn't have to pay any more annual returns, it just snoozes. But it's always lingering there in the background, and it can be reinstated. Liquidation and winding up a solvent company, or even in the case of an insolvent company, in this instance, you're going to kill this company dead, dead, dead. It can never come back to haunt you once it is dead. So therefore, the process of going through liquidation is far more complex. You have to fill in all kinds of forms, and you have to notify all your creditors beforehand, so that they can then object, and they must get paid out of the assets before the company is killed off. It can be done on a voluntary basis, and you have a special resolution, and off you send your notice to your creditors, and you go through a process of selling off your assets, paying your creditors, to the point where you end up with no assets, no liabilities, and then you liquidate what's left of this company, which you do through CIPC. If the company is already insolvent, it is governed by Chapter 14 of the Companies Act, and it's quite a detailed process that one has to go through, and you can really specialize in that if it's something that interests you, but it's not in the course and scope of this particular course. As I've mentioned, deregistering a company means it can be restated, whereas winding up a company or liquidating a company means that it is dead and you are never seeing this company again. And for my last slide, I have referred you to the CIPC website. There's a lot of information on that website, and if you don't know what to do, Google "how do I change a director on CIPC," and you will literally find a step-by-step guide on how to do it. Then there's a very nice company called Fluid Rock Governance, and I put their website in for you, and they do a lot of training online and in person, but I think the online has more relevance now, and very well experienced, knowledgeable people there who can assist you. They can also give you advice if you're not sure, a question here or there, or they can actually perform certain functions for you. So please feel free to do that. And I've also put the number of Morstat Corporate Services, a lady by the name of Diane, who has done my statutory work for me for, goodness me, the last 15 years, and I find it's absolutely worthwhile using an expert. So please feel free to use those resources. Enjoy the rest of your evening. It's been wonderful to engage with you.